Late at night on a quiet road, red and blue lights flash behind a car. The driver pulls over, heart rate rising just a little. The window rolls down. A police officer approaches calmly, shines a light into the car, and then asks a question that millions of drivers hear every single day. Do you know why I stopped you? It sounds simple, harmless even, almost conversational, and yet legal experts across the United States, including former prosecutors, defense attorneys, and constitutional scholars, often warn that this single question can quietly determine the entire direction of a traffic stop, because the way a driver answers it can shape what happens next. It can influence what the officer believes. It can affect what gets written in a report, and in some cases it can even end up being used later in court. So here's a question for you before we go any further. If a police officer pulled you over right now and asked, "Do you know why I stopped you?" What would you say? Would you guess the reason? Would you apologize? Would you stay silent? Or would you try to explain? Take a moment and think about it. And if you want, write your answer in the comments. Because by the end of this documentary, you might see that question very differently than you do right now. Traffic stops are one of the most common interactions between citizens and law enforcement in the modern world. In the United States alone, tens of millions of drivers are stopped every year. Some studies estimate that more than 50,000 traffic stops occur every single day across the country. Most of these encounters are routine: a broken taillight, a rolling stop sign, driving slightly above the speed limit. But despite how ordinary they seem, traffic stops operate inside a very specific legal framework that many drivers are not aware of. The law surrounding them has been shaped by decades of court decisions, constitutional debates, and real-world encounters between officers and citizens. To understand why that simple question matters so much, we need to step back and look at the structure of a traffic stop itself. Legally speaking, a traffic stop is considered a temporary detention under the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution. The Fourth Amendment protects people from unreasonable searches and seizures. That means police officers must generally have a lawful reason, known as reasonable suspicion, to stop a vehicle. Reasonable suspicion is a lower standard than probable cause. It simply means the officer must have specific and articulable facts suggesting that a traffic law or other law may have been violated. For example, an officer might observe a driver speeding, drifting between lanes, failing to signal, or having expired registration. Once the stop occurs, the officer is allowed to briefly detain the driver while investigating the suspected violation. During that time, the officer typically asks for three things: driver's license, vehicle registration, proof of insurance. These requests are considered part of the normal administrative process of a traffic stop. But alongside those routine requests, officers often ask additional questions. And that's where things become interesting, because the purpose of those questions is not always obvious. Some questions are simply meant to gather information. Others help officers evaluate whether a driver might be impaired or distracted. But some questions are strategic. And the question, "Do you know why I stopped you?" falls into that category. On the surface, it seems like a polite way to begin a conversation. But many legal professionals explain that it serves several purposes at once. First, it allows the officer to see whether the driver will admit to a violation. If a driver immediately says something like, "Yes, officer, I know I was speeding," that statement can become a voluntary admission. Second, it gives the officer insight into the driver's awareness and behavior. A confused response might suggest distraction. A defensive response might raise suspicion. Third, it helps establish a conversational baseline. Law enforcement training often emphasizes observing body language, tone, and reactions during an encounter. In other words, that simple question can reveal a lot. But here's the important part that many drivers don't realize. Drivers are not legally required to answer investigative questions during a traffic stop. They are required to identify themselves and provide documentation. But answering questions about where they're coming from, where they're going, or whether they believe they committed a violation is typically voluntary. This principle is connected to the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, which protects individuals from being compelled to incriminate themselves. The Fifth Amendment states that no person shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself. Over time, courts have interpreted this protection to include the right to remain silent during police questioning. Many people associate this right with the famous Miranda warning, the phrase most people recognize from television and movies. You have the right to remain silent. However, Miranda warnings are generally required only during custodial interrogation, meaning when someone is in police custody and being questioned. A routine traffic stop usually does not qualify as custody in the legal sense. That means officers typically do not have to read Miranda rights during a standard traffic stop, but the underlying Fifth Amendment protection still exists. Drivers still have the right not to answer questions that could potentially incriminate them. This is where the legal nuance becomes important, because while a driver may choose to answer questions, those answers can sometimes create complications later. Imagine a situation where a driver is pulled over for allegedly speeding. The officer asks, "Do you know why I stopped you?" The driver responds casually, "Yeah, I was probably going a little fast." From the driver's perspective, it might feel like a polite acknowledgement, but legally speaking, that statement could be interpreted as an admission. If the case later goes to court, for example, if the driver challenges the citation, the officer's report might include the statement that the driver admitted speeding. Now imagine a different response. The driver says calmly, "I'm not sure, officer." In that case, there is no admission. The officer still has their observation and whatever evidence they gathered, radar readings, pacing, or visual estimation, but the driver has not provided a statement confirming the violation. Defense attorneys often point out that small differences like this can sometimes matter in court. Not always, but sometimes. This is why many legal educators emphasize the importance of understanding your rights during police encounters. Understanding your rights does not mean being confrontational, it does not mean refusing lawful instructions, and it certainly does not mean attempting to evade responsibility if a violation actually occurred. Instead, it simply means knowing the legal boundaries of the interaction, and knowing that you are allowed to communicate carefully. Many lawyers suggest that if drivers choose not to answer investigative questions, they should remain calm, respectful, and polite. Tone matters. Attitude matters. Because traffic stops involve real human interactions, and mutual respect often helps keep those encounters safe and professional. Across the country, countless examples illustrate how small statements during traffic stops can have unexpected consequences. In some cases, a driver's casual comment about having just one drink earlier has led officers to begin a DUI investigation. In other situations, a driver explaining that they were running late has been interpreted as confirming a speeding violation. Again, none of these outcomes are automatic, but they demonstrate how conversations during a stop can influence what happens next. Law schools often teach future attorneys about the power of statements made during encounters with law enforcement. Once something is said voluntarily, it may become part of the official record, and official records can follow a case all the way into a courtroom. Another interesting aspect of traffic stops is how officers are trained to structure conversations. Police academies across the country teach communication techniques designed to gather information efficiently and safely. Officers learn to observe behavior, ask open-ended questions, and look for inconsistencies. This is not necessarily about tricking people, it's about gathering information during a brief encounter that could potentially involve safety risks. Remember, traffic stops can be unpredictable. Officers do not know who they are approaching or what situation they may encounter. Because of this, law enforcement training emphasizes caution and awareness. At the same time, drivers also benefit from understanding how these interactions work. Knowledge helps reduce anxiety, it helps people stay calm, and it helps them make thoughtful decisions about how to respond. One important thing to remember is that most traffic stops end quickly and uneventfully. The officer explains the reason for the stop. Documentation is checked, a warning or citation may be issued, and the driver continues on their way. But even in those routine situations, communication choices can shape the experience. Some drivers instinctively begin explaining everything the moment the officer reaches the window. Others remain completely silent. Most interactions fall somewhere in between. Legal professionals often recommend a balanced approach. Provide the required documents, answer basic identification questions, remain polite, and think carefully before making statements about potential violations. This approach respects both the law and the reality of the situation. It avoids unnecessary tension while still protecting legal rights. Another detail that many drivers find surprising is how frequently traffic stops are recorded. In many jurisdictions, police vehicles are equipped with dashboard cameras. Officers may also wear body cameras. These recordings capture the entire interaction, including everything that is said. That means statements made during a stop may be preserved on video and audio. For defense attorneys reviewing cases later, these recordings can be extremely important. They provide an objective record of what occurred during the stop, and they sometimes reveal how questions were asked and answered. From a legal standpoint, clarity matters. Words matter. Tone matters. Context matters. This brings us back to the original question that started this entire discussion. Do you know why I stopped you? On its face, it is just a question, but behind it lies a complex web of legal principles, communication strategies, and human psychology. Some drivers answer confidently, some guess, some apologize, some simply say they are not sure. Each response carries its own implications, and none of them automatically determines the outcome of the stop. But understanding the context helps drivers navigate the situation thoughtfully. Perhaps the most important takeaway is that knowledge reduces fear. When people understand their rights and responsibilities, they are better prepared for real-world encounters. They can remain calm. They can communicate respectfully. and they can avoid making statements they later wish they had not made. Law enforcement officers perform an important and often difficult job. They enforce traffic laws that exist to protect public safety. At the same time, citizens also have constitutional protections designed to ensure fairness and accountability. The balance between those two principles is one of the defining features of modern democratic societies. Traffic stops are a small but significant example of that balance in action. Two individuals, an officer and a driver, meeting briefly on the side of a road, each with their own responsibilities. Each operating within a legal framework shaped by decades of history. And sometimes it all begins with a simple question. So the next time you see flashing lights in your rearview mirror, remember this moment. Remember that the conversation that follows is part of a larger legal and human story. And now that you understand the context behind that familiar question, think again about the answer you might give. Would you respond differently now? Would you choose your words more carefully? Or would you say exactly what you thought before? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. Your perspective might help someone else better understand how these everyday encounters really work. Because the road is something we all share, and sometimes the most important knowledge is the knowledge that keeps ordinary moments from becoming complicated ones.